I want to teach you how you can instantly become a better photographer and give you a strong foundation to build upon. After this, you will get a good understanding about aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Maybe you are into moody and cinematic night photography, or you want to freeze time for that amazing reflection. Don't worry, I got you covered. After this video, you will be able to go from auto to amazing. Best of all, it will take less than 10 minutes of your time. If you want to know about different camera modes, I will show that at the end of this video. First out is aperture. And aperture is also the first thing I set when I take a photograph. Aperture is the size of the opening in your lens. It's referred to as f-stops. Aperture will control your depth of field and how blurry your background will be. This is often referred to as Bokeh, the Japanese word for blur or haze. That is also why it will control the story you want to tell, and that's also why it should be the first thing you set. But this is where it can become a little bit complicated. The lower the number, the larger the opening in your lens, and the more light will hit your sensor, and the shorter depth of field will you have. And the opposite is, the higher the number, the smaller the opening in your lens, the less light will hit your sensor, and the longer depth of field will you have. A little bit confusing, right? The easier way to remember is a low number is a short depth of field. A high number is long depth of field. I've taken a few photographs with different f-stops to show you. First shot is at f1.4. The second shot at f2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, and lastly f22. As you could see, when the aperture went up, so did the depth of field. That means if you want to have one subject in focus and blur out the rest of the background, you should go low. Depending on your lens, that could be 1.4, 1.8 or 2, or at some cases even 2.8 or 4. But the lowest possible f-stop or aperture will give you the most bokeh or background blur. On the other hand, if you want to put that subject into context, you can't blur out the entire background, and then you should go with an aperture maybe around 5.6 or even 8. That will prevent the entire background to be blurry, and immediately we are telling a different story. But if you are shooting a photo where you want everything in focus, typical a landscape photo, then we will need f11, f16 or maybe even f22 to ensure that everything in focus, nothing is blurry. I want to add one important thing when it comes to aperture. Remember that aperture is relative to your distance to your subject. If you are far away from your subject and use a low aperture, low number, you will still have most of the image in focus. I've taken two images to illustrate this. One image is taken at f1.4 and one image is taken at f11. And as you can see, it's hardly any difference in the depth of field. The reason for this is that I'm standing almost 50 meters or 160 foot away. So because I'm so far away from my subject, remember, aperture is relative to your distance to your subject, my background will not be blurred out. So if you experience this, you need to go closer to your subject. Shutter speed is the next thing on our list and is equally important to understand to become a better photographer. Shutter speed controls the amount of time your shutter will be open. Even on the new type of cameras and mirrorless cameras, we still talk about shutter speed. So the theory will be the same no matter what camera you have. Shutter speed would typically be 1/60th of a second, 1/125th of a second, 1/250th of a second, and so on. It could be on the other side as well, so it can be 2 seconds or 5 seconds or even 30 seconds. Shutter speed will also control the amount of light that will be needed for a good photo, because the faster the shutter speed, the less amount of light will actually have time to hit your sensor. It's fairly logical, but most important, shutter speed is used to control motion blur. If you want to have motion blur, you need to have a slow shutter speed. If you don't want any motion blur, you will need to have a fast shutter speed. So for example, if you want to take a photo of someone walking on the street, you would need 1/125th of a second, or maybe even 1/250th of a second. Or if you're shooting action sports like soccer or basketball, you will need 1/1000th of a second or even faster. The downside of that is the faster your shutter, the less light will actually have time to hit your sensor. So you can only use really fast shutter speeds if you have good lighting conditions. I personally feel shutter speed feels a lot more logical than aperture, but it can still be a little bit tricky. So I want to show you as well. I will use a tram because it's very typical for Gothenburg and it's fun to photograph, and I will shoot a tram with 2 different types of shutter speed, and I will show you. So let's look at it. At 0.3 second, the motion blur is obvious. 250th of a second and the tram is frozen in motion. As you could see with those 2 quick examples, shutter speed will really influence your motion blur. So for fast moving objects, you will need to match with a high shutter speed. Lastly, we have ISO. No, it's not ISO, it's ISO, it's not an acronym. ISO will control your camera's sensor sensitivity. The lower your ISO, the higher the sensitivity, but the more light it will require. On the other hand, higher ISO will mean more light, but also more noise. A low ISO will give you higher quality and less noise, but it will require more light. On the opposite, a high ISO will require less light, but it will become more noisy. A good rule of thumb is to keep your ISO as low as possible, but it will be the last thing you should set for a photograph. I often leave my ISO on auto. ISO will go in fixed numbers. ISO 100, ISO 200, 400, 800 and so on. On some cameras you can go below 100. For example, I have ISO 50 on my Canon R6. I've taken some photos with different types of ISO, so I will show you. First shot is at ISO 100. Second shot at ISO 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400. And lastly, and for the fun of it, ISO 102,400. So, putting it all together. First, I set my aperture. I will look at my scene and decide upon the story I want to tell. Will I need isolation or will I need context? Then I will set my shutter speed. Again, what story am I telling? But also, am I shooting a moving subject or not? Last, I will set my ISO or even let my camera set it for me. This will greatly depend on the camera you are using. With my Canon R6, I can be much looser as it's so amazing managing low light and high ISOs. On the other hand, if I'm shooting with my Canon M50, I usually need to set the ISO manually. Now when we know all this, it's gonna be much easier to also troubleshoot our photos. For example, if a scene is too dark, I can raise my ISO, I can lower my shutter speed, or I can adjust my aperture. The reason why I will adjust the aperture last is because it sets first in relation to the story we are telling. On the opposite, if a scene is too light, then we can lower our ISO, we can increase our shutter speed, or we can lower our aperture. I promised that I would cover camera modes at the end, and that's also what we're gonna do. I usually shoot aperture priority when I'm doing street photography. And the reason for that is I know the aperture I want to do and I let the camera decide the rest. If I were, for example, to shoot action sport, I would probably go with the shutter priority and let the camera handle the rest. Of course, unless shooting completely manual, it will give me a lot more control, but it's also usually a little bit slower because there are so much settings you actually need to keep track of. Different cameras will have different names for different modes, so you just need to check your manual for your type of camera. I really hope you feel this video was worth your time and that you have learned something. I also hope I could help you, maybe even encourage you to go out and test different modes and go out taking photos without using the auto mode. I also hope that next time you take a photo you are not happy with, you will know how to fix it. If you have any questions about anything, please leave them in the comments below. I will answer all your questions. As always, thank you very much for watching. Until next time.